Welcome to Washington Update. I'm host Bill Greiner, and I'm joined in BCTV studios today by U.S. Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Welcome, Jeanne.
Nice to be with you.
Thanks for coming in
on
today.
This snowy morning.
It is a snowy morning. Hopefully we won't see a lot of these, but it is the time of the year. I wanted to talk to you about kind of the state of things in Washington, D.C. We just finished an election cycle,
Right.
off-year cycle, but it seemed like it was a pretty active year, big turnout, not just here in New Hampshire, but across the country. Some mixed messages that are out there. And I think one thing that people like to get to is some sort of bipartisanship, some sort of consensus building. You've been great about that. We've talked about that in the past when you've been on the show. What are some of the things that you think in this next two-year term that we've got coming up that can be done from a bipartisan perspective that will get people reaching across party lines and maybe, even though we have election year coming up, take some of the divisiveness down and some of the rhetoric down?
Well, you know, that's probably the number one thing I hear from people as I travel around New Hampshire. It's, why can't you all work together to address the challenges that we face? And I appreciate that. I think that's really important. One of the most frustrating things for me in Washington is the partisanship. But I do think there's a lot more bipartisanship than gets talked about often, because lots of the media coverage is about the controversy, and if you're getting along, it doesn't make as exciting news sometimes for people. But there was one area in particular that I think people really worked closely together on this year, and that's actually for the last couple of years, and that's been addressing the opioid epidemic. And we just passed, before we got out in October for the elections, two major pieces of legislation to address that have dramatic impacts on New Hampshire. One was funding. We've increased funding now to address the opioid epidemic very significantly, over $3 billion for this fiscal year. And what that's translated to for New Hampshire is a significant set aside for states that are hardest hit. It's one of the things that I and Senator Hassan, when she got there, worked very hard to make sure that for states like New Hampshire, where we have an overwhelming impact from opioids and substance use disorders, that we get additional funding, because as small states, we are more hard hit by the epidemic than some of the larger states are per capita. So we have about 7 times more dollars this year in state opioid response grants than we've had last time. So in 2018, we had about $3 million. In this year, we're going to have about $23 million in New Hampshire, so 7 times more, which should help a great deal as the state's responding, trying to set up, making sure that there's treatment for folks within an hour's distance for everybody in New Hampshire.
One other thing that comes to my mind is a really simple bipartisan issue, and I honestly had a lot of hope coming when the president was elected, because it's something that was talked about and it's gone nowhere, is infrastructure.
Absolutely.
You know, it was something that he talked about. I think a lot of people, both sides of the aisle, really want to do something with infrastructure, and then it's really not gotten much talk, maybe just because there have been other things that have been distracting. But New Hampshire, as you know, having been the former governor, is a state where we don't necessarily have a lot of funds to take care of our roads. We have a 10-year program, which sometimes ends up being 20 years, and we're finally seeing that here in Bedford with the Route 101 widening. But you need federal dollars to help with the infrastructure needs, whether it's the roads and the bridges are a problem, not just here in New Hampshire, but everywhere. Where do you see that going? Because it would, again, seem to me that that's a great place to start and have cross-aisle consensus.
I think it is too, not just to address roads and bridges, but also to address water and sewer projects and other municipal buildings, schools that have experienced deterioration. I think this is a place where there is tremendous support on both sides of the aisle to get it done. And the challenge has been that we haven't had a bill presented to us by the White House that has real public dollar spending in it, that has the details worked out. And again, like you, I was hopeful that President Trump, because of his business background, should understand the importance of this and would be willing to work with Congress on that. But so far, we haven't seen a plan.
And do you have people that are kind of go-to people on the other side of the aisle? Obviously, not all 52, 3, 4 of them, however there might be, but 1 or 2 or 3 where you could go and have these conversations and say, look, let's try to work together, at least in this cycle, and get something like infrastructure moving forward? Are there a couple of people that you do that with, and how does that
Sure.
dynamic work for folks who don't always see that there's a bipartisan function in Congress, which of course there is, as you say,
Right.
most of the time?
That's right. Nothing gets done in Congress without bipartisan support, despite what you may see on the news. And yes, a lot of us are focused on issues that come before our committees. So we work very closely on people who are on the same committees that we are. So I'm on the Small Business Committee. The chairman of that committee is Jim Risch from Idaho. He and I are on many things, are about as far apart as you can get in terms of our voting. But on small business, we work together very closely and have passed a number of pieces of legislation to help small businesses here in New Hampshire. You know, on foreign policy, that's another area where there's a lot of bipartisan support. I'm just got back from what's called the Halifax Security Forum, where I led a bipartisan delegation of 7 senators, 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and we talked about the ways in which we work together on foreign policy. So I think there's a lot more working together than most people see. Unfortunately, a lot of it is behind the scenes, and if anything, if we're working on an issue that gets political, then that gets broken down along partisan lines. But if we can keep it on things that we understand need to be done for the country, then that works very well.
I think you're well known and well respected sitting on foreign relations. I think that's well known in our state. What may not be as well known is the fact that you are on that small business committee. As a business owner, I know that, and I think that people should understand that that's a great resource. You know, in the Senate, it's great to have you as an advocate for small business, for New Hampshire small business there, and that you are an accessible person. Your office is very accessible. I don't think you really pay attention to what letter comes after somebody's name when they
That's
call
right.
your
We
office.
we don't ask if you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent or unaffiliated when you call our office.
And I think that's important for people to understand, because that is the backbone, as you know, former governor, you've been a sitting senator now. You understand how important small business is in our
Absolutely.
state, and without small business, we wouldn't be where we are.
Absolutely. About 99% of employers in New Hampshire, one of the highest in the country, are small businesses, and we need to make sure that they prosper. Also, as you know, 2 out of 3 new jobs are created from small businesses. They have 16 times more patents than big businesses, which is one of my favorite statistics, because I think most people don't realize that small businesses are so innovative. And then if we look at the number of women-owned businesses and veteran-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses, we're looking at a significant base for job creation in New Hampshire and in the country.
Speaking of small business, let's talk about health insurance. That was, as you know, it's been a contentious issue for the last
Huge. It's a huge
decade,
issue.
probably. And there was some infighting along mostly partisan lines, I think, last time. Where do we go from here with health insurance? I'm sure that's one of the top questions you hear from when you talk to business owners about business. So what do you see the landscape as? What do you see a path going forward?
Well, as you point out, it's challenging, and it's been particularly challenging for small businesses who want to try and cover their employees as they try and keep people working for them, have had difficulty with the costs of particularly individual plans. So I'm hopeful that we will see some bipartisan support for a change around supporting the Affordable Care Act. Now, there was a lot of controversy when that passed, but what we've seen as it's been implemented is that there are about 30 million more people who have access to health care in this country. In New Hampshire, we have about 100,000 who, because of the expansion of Medicaid and because of enrollment in the Affordable Care Act.
So that's about 10% of our population.
That's right. And they're able now to get health care. And so people want that. They want to be able to know that when they get sick or when their kids get sick, that they can go to the doctor and not have to worry about paying the bills. I have been disappointed that we've not seen a bipartisan effort to try and address the things that have not worked about the Affordable Care Act. You know, after the repeal effort last year, there was a real coming together in the Senate and an effort to address some of the market challenges, the insurers who were pulling out of certain markets in the country, the costs that were being driven up because of the administration cut off the what are called the cost sharing reduction payments, which are basically payments that help cover people who are uninsured. That drove up the costs of health insurance. And we had legislation that would have addressed that, at least in the short term. And unfortunately, that went nowhere. Even though it had strong bipartisan support, I think if it had been brought to the floor, we would have been able to pass it. So we are seeing this year some of the rates being more affordable in New Hampshire, because one of the things that some of the insurers did was to overestimate what the rates would be, and so now they're making that correction and the rates are going down. So that's good news for this coming year for a lot of people, but long term, we've got to address the issues in the Affordable Care Act, and I'm really hopeful that we can do it together, because there are ways to fix this that are going to make it work for even more people.
Are there a couple of things that if you got to sit in a room with a couple folks and craft something that was going to get voted on that made changes to that bill, what would they be?
Well, in the short term, it would be to address those payments that have, because they've not been available, have meant that insurance companies have had to increase rates in certain markets because they weren't sure if they were going to be able to get the number of people enrolled and the coverage that would allow them to keep rates affordable. So that's one thing. One of the things that I worked on, and it's been the only bipartisan change to the Affordable Care Act since we passed it, and Tim Scott and I put in a provision that would allow states to decide if the market size was 50 or 100. I can see people's eyes glazing over as we're talking about this because it's complicated, but would allow states to decide whether what market size was going to be for the essential benefits of insurance plans. So to decide if they were going to be more affordable in some cases if the group size was smaller. So I think there are things like that that we can do. There have been hundreds of pieces of legislation in the Senate alone. Over 400 bills have been introduced to address health care and changes in the Affordable Care Act. But what we need is a commitment from leadership to work together. And one area where I think the president has talked about making changes that I think we could all agree on is with the cost of prescription drugs. That's one of the biggest cost drivers in healthcare, and there are some things that we could do, starting with allowing Medicare to actually negotiate for the prescription drugs in the way that the VA does.
Can you explain to the average viewer why that isn't in place today? Because that seems so common sense.
It does seem so common sense. Well, all I can say is that when President Bush was president, that he agreed with the prescription drug companies when they were working on the prescription drug benefit under Medicare, that Medicare, they would not try and negotiate with Medicare for the cost of those prescription drugs. And that's the way it's stayed since that time. Now, again, I think there would be a lot of support in the Senate to change that provision because the VA does it. And if you talk to people who get prescription drugs through the Veterans Administration, they pay a significant lower cost than many people have to get on the market when they're buying prescription drugs.
And you think the president would support something along those lines, some sort of change to that?
Well, it's not clear. He said that he thinks we should work on lowering the cost of prescription drugs, but again, we haven't seen any proposal from him. So I'm hopeful that this is one area that we might be able to work together on.
One other question on healthcare before we leave that topic deals with the Affordable Care Act. And I think one thing that most people feel pretty strongly about was protecting and really carving out pre-existing conditions, which, as you know, had been an issue and had bankrupted families, caused agonizing choices to be made that just are completely unnecessary because of no coverage, because somebody had been sick, and that's
right.
Just happens. Do you see that as vulnerable?
I do sadly see it as vulnerable, and as you say, if you go into a room and ask who here either has a pre-existing condition or knows somebody who does, almost everybody raises their hand. You know, my oldest granddaughter has type 1 diabetes. I hate to think that when she gets out of college that she's not going to be able to get health insurance because she has type 1 diabetes through no fault of her own. It's not anything that she did or anybody else did. And that's the case with people who have pre-existing conditions. Sadly, the Justice Department stopped defending a lawsuit that's been brought down in Texas that would undercut pre-existing conditions. That lawsuit seems to be working its way up to the Supreme Court, and yet we are not defending that aspect of health care coverage as a government. So I'm very concerned about that. We've heard the President and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid come out and say it's okay to provide these short-term plans that don't provide that kind of coverage, that have low copays. Some people call them junk plans. But basically, it's health coverage, but for so many problems that people have when they need their health insurance, if they go to use those plans, they'll find that they don't actually have coverage for that. And that's a real problem.
Can you talk about some of the ongoing efforts to address the PFAS contamination?
The PFAS?
Yes.
You know, it's a much more widespread issue than I think anybody realized a decade ago. PFAS is a kind of chemical that we're just learning about. Right now it's not considered a pollutant, it's called a contaminant, which means that it doesn't have the same qualifications for regulation that some pollutants do. And what we've learned is that it turned up in the water supply in the city of Portsmouth and now also in the town of Merrimack. And it's from chemicals that were used in Portsmouth's case for firefighting by the Air Force at Pease Air Force Base. In Merrimack, it was used by Saint-Gobain in their products that they were making. And what we're learning is that it exists all over the country. And we don't know yet what the health impacts of drinking water that's been contaminated by the various PFAS chemicals is. I've been working very hard with the support of lots of people in Portsmouth to try and get a health study, and I'm pleased to say that we were able to get funding in the defense bill to authorize that, and then funding in the appropriations bills for 2 years for that health study. That's going to be done by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a long name, but they are doing that health study to determine what the potential health effects are of the disease. And Pease and Portsmouth have been designated as the model for this study. Again, thanks in large part to a number of people we call the Pease moms down in Portsmouth, who sadly had children who were in child care centers at Pease who drank the water. And we don't know, we haven't done enough research to be able to say what the health impacts of that are going to be. And that just shouldn't happen in America. You know, you should be able to drink the water without having to worry about whether it's going to hurt your health in the future.
Yeah, no, and Michigan has had that crisis
Absolutely.
in Flint, and as much as it's been publicized, it still remains an issue. And without vital drinking water, you don't have property values, you don't have health, you don't have
Absolutely.
anything.
That's exactly right, as you know very well. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to have a study that's going to answer some of those questions for people. And again, in Portsmouth, in Merrimack, in communities all across the country, it's the people who live in those communities who have been affected, who have stood up and said, we want to know what the answers to these questions are. We want to know how much you can have in our drinking water, if any. We want to know what that means for the health of our families in the future. And so working with them, we're trying very hard to get some answers.
One topic that I hear some concern about with the current administration, and maybe not the administration per se, although maybe it is, maybe it's just some people on the other side of the aisle from where you are, deals with the entitlements and concern that they're going to see some cutbacks to Medicare, maybe some impacts on Social Security. What are you seeing? What are you hearing on the ground? And what would you tell folks that are concerned about that? And it's a real concern for a big segment of our population here in New Hampshire.
Absolutely it is, because there are so many people seniors who depend on Medicare. It's one of the most, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid have been one of the most successful programs in keeping people from falling into poverty and trying to take care of people. And I think that has started because what we heard from some of the leadership in Congress, from Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan was that in order to pay for the tax bill that has cost a lot more money than initially anticipated, about $1.3 trillion, that we were going to have to look at the spending on those programs, Medicare and Medicaid, to pay for that. Now, I don't think anybody's going to believe that that's the way to pay for that debt. I think there are things that we can do, but I don't think that's the way to do it. We don't want to tell people as they're aging and as they've paid for Medicare, as they've paid for Social Security, that you no longer have the ability to collect on these programs that you've paid into.
And I think that's concerning for people, and I think it's good to hear your perspective. Sometimes the headlines are enough to scare.
Right.
If it's beyond the headlines, that's kind of more cause. And so I think people need to know that there will be people that are going to stand up and fight to make sure that those things that are so important and so needed to a segment of the population don't become a bargaining chip.
Absolutely. And as you know, that was an issue in the congressional race in the 1st District here in New Hampshire. And I think people listened to what both candidates had to say, and that was a factor in how that race turned out.
What can you tell us about your work for the USS Thresher Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery? What can you tell folks about?
The Thresher is still very real for so many of the families who were affected by it. You know, I remember when I went on my first trade mission as governor, one of the people who went with us had lost his dad on the Thresher. I have a good friend and neighbor who babysat for kids who lost their father on the Thresher. And so this is still very real for so many people in New Hampshire. And one of the things that the families would like to see is a memorial at Arlington National Cemetery to the Thresher, to all of the men. There were not just military, but there were civilians also lost on the Thresher. It's been 55 years ago. And so we are working, there are 5 senators from New England, it's bipartisan and bi-state, tri-state actually, to try and get the Secretary of the Army to designate a particular spot for memorial of the Thresher. And that's been done in some other cases for example, the failed mission in Iran after the hostage crisis. There's a memorial for that, for the Challenger. So there is some precedent for specific tragedies to have those memorials. And I think one of the things that's important to remember about the Thresher is not just those people who were lost, but what happened as the result of that. Because what happened is the Navy looked at that accident and made a whole range of changes to our submarine program that have saved countless lives in the intervening time. So there are a couple of reasons to memorialize that accident.
You are a very active senator. You're very connected, continue to be, to New Hampshire. You come back here weekly as often as you can be. And you know, I've known all of the senators since I've lived here for 23 years. And I would say that none are as active as you've been, none are as visible as you've been in the communities. When you come back,
nice.
you're back. You talk to a lot of people all the time. What are you hearing from people that their concerns are? What are you hearing them say that they would like you as their senator to do for them, regardless of what their party background is? Because you are in the trenches in New Hampshire a lot.
Well, a couple of things. You know, one of the things that I believe very strongly and have since I was governor is that as a public elected official, we're there to serve the public. And one of the things that we can do in my Senate office is to help people who are having problems working with the federal government, whether that's veterans, whether it's somebody who can't get their Social Security benefits, whether it's somebody who can't get enrolled in health insurance. There are a whole range of things that we can help by connecting them with the right people in government to make a difference in their lives. You know, when in the years following the financial crisis, we helped a lot of people who were about to get kicked out of their homes to be able to stay in. So that's one of the things that I think it's really important as a senator or as an elected official to do, to try and help whoever calls our office with whatever their issues are. I feel like we can probably do more to change people's lives by responding to people in that way than with almost any piece of legislation that we pass. But the other thing that I'm hearing from people is they're worried about the divisions in this country. They're worried about the partisanship. They're worried about the lack of civil discourse, the lack of respect for each other. I think it's important for us to say, we can disagree. We don't, my husband and I don't share views on everything. But we can do it in a way that's respectful, in a way that understands that there's another point of view, and we can try and compromise or try and see each other's point of view. And I think that's really important, and I think that was one of the messages of the election.
I think anybody that knows you, and I certainly have known you for a long time, knows that you're a bipartisan person. You look to find solutions, not necessarily to create problems, as others may do. And I know you have a relationship with our governor who is not of your party. Talk about, one or two things that you guys may have shared, or the things that you can do together, or you're doing together to show that you may be a different party. You both represent the people in New Hampshire, just in different roles.
Well, I think one of the most important things is to address the opioid crisis that we're experiencing. It's a place where the state officials, where the governor, where our office works very closely together to look at what our needs are, to try and make sure the funding is there, to make sure that in addition to that funding bill, we also passed something called the Support Act to address medication-assisted treatment, which is one of the best ways to address substance use disorders, to try and help children who we're now looking at another generation that's being affected because of usage in families. And that's an area where we work very closely together.
We have about a minute to go, Senator. Is there anything else you'd like to say in closing to the folks that are watching? Any thoughts that you want to leave them with in the holiday season?
Well, we are entering this holiday season, and one of the things that we're all there to try and support programs like Toys for Tots, to try and support families in transition, and New Horizons in New Hampshire. We've all shared those platforms together to point out that there's a lot more that brings us together than divides us, and it's a message we need to take this holiday season to our neighbors, to our friends, to remind us all that we need to work together. We need to help those people in need this holiday season, make sure that no family goes unremembered.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I hope you and your family have a great holiday season.
You too.
And I look forward to having you back on the show beginning of the year with another update.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.